And we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Coronavirus Conversations, a daily series of lunchtime webinars from us here at Richland Source. And I want to thank you all for being here and for joining us today for our topic of pro tips for newly remote workers. Many of us are in a strange new time in our work lives where we're working remote, and we wanted to see if we could provide some resources for how to do that really well. And I'm joined here by my friend and colleague, Chris Krewson of Lion Publishers. Chris was most recently the Vice President of Strategy for Spirited Media, which was the parent company of 3 independent news sites, Billy Penn in Philadelphia, The Incline in Pittsburgh, and Denverite in Denver. He was the founding editor of Billy Penn, and prior to his 5 years at Spirited Media, Chris was the top digital editor at both Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. As well as being a good friend of mine, we work together at Lion Publishers. Chris is our executive director, and I sit on Chris's board. And I've gotten to know him over the last couple of years and really respect his leadership and his knowledge of this topic a tremendous amount. So I'm really glad. And Chris, apropos to today's topic, is joining us remotely from Philadelphia. Say hi, Chris.
Hey, everybody.
Also joining us today from the source is Brittany Schock. Brittany's in the chat, and she's here to help drop in helpful links or manage your questions for anything that you might need. And finally, I just want to say thank you to all of our members, who are now 800 and counting, and our newsroom partners, as well as, and we can announce this right now because this will be the first, because today we just got the okay to announce it, who our members and newsroom partners are the power behind this webinar and all of our COVID-19 coverage. And we just learned today that this is also brought to you in part by a generous grant from the Facebook Journalism Project, which Richland Source competed for, and we were one of the first 50 newsrooms in the country to get that grant. So we want to say thanks to the Facebook Journalism Projects. Thanks, Chris. And we're going to start off today's webinar just like we normally do. We'll have a guided conversation with Chris over the first 20 minutes or so, and then we'll jump in with your questions. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and Brittany can add them or use the Ask a Question feature. We also have a poll today, which the poll is, we're going to ask you to just kind of give us a sense of, before coronavirus, how often did you work remotely? And we're interested in your answers there. To just kind of learn a little bit more about what your remote work styles were and how often you did it. So we're going to jump right in. Is that okay with you, Chris?
Sounds great.
Great, cool. Talk to us a little. One of the things that I'm kind of wondering is, and as we move into this zone where our teams, either we're part of a team or we're running a team that is far away from each other. At least we're certainly not in the same office anymore. You do something with our team at Lion that you refer to as a health check when you check in with them. And I love that idea. And we're starting to do it a little bit more here at the source. But could you talk a little bit more about what a health check is, what a check-in with the team looks like? How do you guys manage that at Lion? And for the folks that are on the chat, talk to us a little bit about where your team members are and just exactly how far away from each other you really are. I mean, when we say remote, you guys are remote.
Yeah. So let me take all those in turn. So and let me give you the why behind the answer, if that's not going off track too much. So in order to attract the best candidates for the jobs that we had open. This is Lion's first time ever able to have employees more than just an executive director. We're the beneficiaries of a Knight Foundation grant and a Democracy Fund grant as well that allowed us to do more than just have one staffer, which has always been the past of Lion. We had an executive director and then a bunch of contractors, and now we have a staff for the first time. So faced with building that staff, what I tried to do is figure out a strategy to let us hire just the best people, not necessarily rent an office in one place, because I felt like that would limit who'd be interested, as well as the fact that we're a national association serving members from Connecticut to California and Hawaii as well, actually. And so it's easier and better for us to be able to attract talent at a national level. That's incredibly complicated because you have to figure out how to hire full-time people, use a payroll provider to do that, provide them with insurance, all these things as a small business of 3, and now 4, we just hired our 4th person. All those things were a challenge to overcome early in the process, but makes us look really freaking smart today because we're used to working from home. We have been from the beginning. So I have our director of revenue and operations is a woman named Paivan Lukumhan. She's based in Barrie, Vermont. She's already been self-isolating since before that was cool. Annika Anand is our director of programming, and she is based in Seattle, Washington, a hotspot. And our newest hire, our manager of membership and communications, is a woman named Kelsey Ryan, and she's based on the Kansas side of Kansas City. And
you're in Philly.
And I live on the outskirts of Philadelphia. I bought a house here when I was the executive online editor at the Inquirer, and used it when I came back to town to launch Billy Penn. My California surgeon represented on my shirt was 4 years in between. So this is my first job working with managing the entire team. When I was with Spirit of Media, my last almost 2 years were a work from home and travel job, which was what this job was until it wasn't anymore. The team health check evolved. One of the things we realized right away, we were fortunate enough when Paivan and Annika started to bring them to Philadelphia for a retreat just to get to know each other, since I had interviewed both of them remotely via video conference calls, Hangouts actually, I think for both. So I hadn't met them in person before. I had met Annika in person. Paivan I met at an event. She was attending in her previous job, and we had breakfast together after she applied, and we realized we were both going to be in Houston. This was last July, I want to say, and they started, both of them started in August of last year. What we realized in that retreat was that we were going to have to be really deliberate about communications. We were not going to be able to pass each other in the hallway or tap each other on the shoulder, turn around and shout out a question to each other, because we were all going to be in different places doing different things. So we started with a daily in-person stand-up sort of scrum. We've arranged Lion in the same way as many software companies. We work in sprints. We check in on each other once a week for how we're progressing on those sprints. We track all this in a program called Airtable, which is all, I will give 100% credit for all this to Annika Anand, who's developed that system and uses Airtable like a ninja, far faster than I do. But that's the primary, we changed those calls, which seemed onerous and burdensome because we have somebody on the West Coast. So she's getting started as we're halfway through our day. Instead, we use a combination for asynchronous communication of Slack, email, Airtable, and Zoom calls. We try to do those team meetings with cameras on at least once a week. We also set aside blocked time in our day on our calendars between 1:30 and 2:30 Eastern. Monday through Friday is time when we can only have internal meetings, and that time is sacred and free. So unless there's absolutely no other time you can schedule an outside call, the outside calls go on either side of that block time, but that block time is for company meetings. Which is why I'm getting off this one at 1 p.m. Eastern, because half an hour later, I have a company meeting. The health check
time is important, but go ahead.
The block time is important. Yeah, the health check is what starts our weekly meetings, where we go over, it's one part of sort of a 4-part standing order before we get to the work that we did the week before and what we're planning to do the week after. All that comes from the world where you're building software. And in order to build complicated software, you break it up into chunks and then track your progress on those chunks, right? And so the stand-up note is the first thing I drop into Slack every morning. Hey, this is what I'm working on today, rough schedule of my calls outside of block time. And here are any blockers. What's going to keep me from doing that work that's above?
Okay.
And then we check those are all sprints are organized, tasks are organized into sprints, and sprints build towards the OKRs that we set for the team. So the team health check is one of 4 things we do when we get a meeting started. We used to use a red, yellow, green stoplight model. Yeah. And, how are you feeling this week? What color are you? This works really well for bigger teams, because if one person on the team is red, the whole team is red. One person is yellow, the whole team is yellow. The goal is to get to green. And we've changed that recently to a different, this is our 3rd meeting using this different kind of format of totally different, not a traffic light metaphor, but a rose, a bud, and a thorn. In other words, and you have to answer for each of them. So this week, what was your thorn? What was your rose, the thing that was a win or a flower, and what was your bud? What's the best potential, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's how we sort of, and everybody describes their own personal rosebud and thorn, and they don't have to be on one topic. It's whatever happened to you in a week that was a win, and what do you see great potential in, and what's kind of a pain. Okay. We also look at, because workflow and communications are so intertwined, we look at whether we had any workflow problems this week. Did we miscommunicate around something, and is that a structural thing or just a one-time thing? Like, why? What's the root of that?
That's cool. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So that's just kind of how we have to be a lot more deliberate about interacting. And we try not to text each other unless it's an emergency. We try to ping each other in Slack. And it's also, exacerbated by, yes, we work from home, but, our spouses and our children are now, in some cases, unexpectedly home with us. Annika had to pull her son out of daycare because of the virus, because she didn't want to send him in, and it's already in a weird drop-off policy, and so she's got a toddler running around the house, and she's trying to being a manager means being kind of extra committed to that flexibility and saying, I don't care if you're in front of your computer for 8 hours at a stretch, as long as what you get done, you need to get done, gets done, and if not, let's figure out how to get it done. So kind of recognizing and understanding at this stage that really nothing is as it should be. Everyone's head's all over the place.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I wanted to touch on, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat here. I did it earlier, but I'm going to do it again. It's from the Harvard Business Review. I was doing some research for today's call, and this is a great, this link that I'm dropping into the chat is a great, simple article about, questions that people would have about remote work and what does this mean if I'm newly remote. And one of the things you touched on was this idea of trust, Chris. And in non-remote teams, there's this thing that happens almost subconsciously where you are being observed, you're observing your coworkers, or you're observing the people that work for you. And you're doing that with your eyes and your ears, and all of your senses are observing their nonverbals, what you're seeing, how they're behaving. And now that's just not the case anymore. And so as a manager, trust has to be such an important component of your team. And in this article from HBR, they talk a little bit about how when a team is isolated from one another and they're alone, we're on chats like this right now, all during the day here and there, and we're doing check-ins. But when you're isolated from each other, your imagination can kind of run wild. And so there's this in this article, and then in another link that I'll post here in a little bit from our friend Rebecca Monson, they're emphasizing the fact that communication has to be much more deliberate and sometimes more than you think is necessary. Have you found that with our team at Lion as well? I know that we have with the Source, is that you just have to almost feel as though you're over communicating.
Yes. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. And repeating things. I mean, I'm already sort of bad at repeating individual things when I'm with people in person, but over communicating, starting out meetings with a "How are you?" and meaning it, right? Asking follow-up questions,
like actual real empathy,
right? the delivery and the setting aside time for small talk serves a purpose that's way more than just, it's a connection. It builds a foundation for an honest conversation afterwards. If you can find some common ground, because everybody's, and it's interesting that I'm hearing that more and more, and people are taking the time to sort of listen and expect an answer that's more than, how are you? Most people have always just kind of said, yeah, I'm great. But we're all in a very similar boat right now, unexpectedly doing the most professional of things in the most personal of places. And it's a time that sort of wears on everybody in weird ways. And so taking the time to sort of have those conversations and recognize that that's the case, I think goes a long way, especially in small teams. The other thing that we do as managers we have one-on-ones with each other deliberately once a week, period. It's just a lock time. It's in the calendar. So I know that if I have a question that I can't really ask in an open meeting and Annika or Pavan are too busy in their roles to answer in the heat of the moment, then I have a time set aside once a week when I can ask that question.
Okay.
And that, Annika and Pavan also have individual one-on-ones, which kind of works in a circle because it's a way to defuse or just sort of like, did you understand what she meant when she said that, or what he meant when he said that, so that we have a structured opportunity, which I'm hoping and thinking kind of cuts down on any, because there's, when you have no central physical location, there's lots of opportunities for missed communication. And we try to remedy that as much as possible. I also have used Slack far more deliberately when it's a sole source of communication versus what I've always used it as, which was an auxiliary, right? Slack was in addition to office communications. And at Spirited, when I was in a local newsroom and reporters, it was just incredibly busy and stuff was happening there all the time. And it was a link dump. And when you're building something, Slack goes off and you wonder whether you have to react to it, right? And so I've been a lot more slow and deliberate and thoughtful about how I use a tool that's designed to interrupt people, basically. Just because it's faster than email doesn't necessarily mean it's better than email for a lot of reasons.
Talk a little bit about, because we're using Slack as sort of an assumed understanding of what Slack is. And I'm guessing that there might be a few people on this call right now that are newly remote, who are used to messaging in their teams to be, via group text and, email chains and that kind of thing. Talk to us a little bit about what Slack is and how you guys use it. And Brittany, maybe you could drop a link to Slack's website into the chat for those who don't use it.
Yeah, so Slack is an asynchronous chat tool. It's almost like group instant messaging through Facebook or GChat or Instant Messenger or whatever. We found it very useful as working in teams, especially its iPhone or mobile app, because it's a way to instantly share a link or have a conversation, and it's kind of structured depending on how you set it up. You set it up different sort of areas to talk, rooms or channels they're called, and it's also archived, so you can more easily find and arrange and thread or link together conversations that you have around different aspects of many things. There's a lot of Slacks that are set up for offices. There are also Slacks in journalism, the field we work in, that are sort of ways to structure asynchronous conversations about getting together, working together. Data geeks have a Slack. Journalists of color have their own Slack instance, and it's just a place to go. And with a like mind, it's a community tool, basically.
Yeah, we started using it when we moved into our co-working facility, because when we opened that, we had never used Slack before, period. And we started to use it, and I cannot imagine doing what we do now without it at this point in time. Like, it is sort of like it went from being a new thing that we introduced to being a foundational thing that there's zero chance that we would work without it again. Like, it's like it becomes one of those foundational tools. And I think one of the things that I've noticed about it that's been so interesting is that as we onboard a team member or we bring someone into a conversation, that's the last time I have to think about making sure that if I post in that particular channel, like the source employees channel, I never have to remember, did I forget to put Steve on the email chain?
Right.
Because now it's just everyone's getting that message at the same time. And it really does it cuts down on email, it cuts down on group texts, which are, a pain in the neck to manage. And it's been really, really useful to us. I want to jump real quick to something that our mutual friend Rebecca Monson of Where By Us recently wrote a piece on Medium, which there's a link in the chat at the very top of the chat bot. And then it's also, we can drop another link in here in just a second, where it's sort of a wonky piece, and it talks a little bit about managing her team, but what she's done. But one of the things that I loved about that piece was, and she dives into it, is that she described her remote management style as shoes optional, documentation required. And I thought that was just really, really important in terms of what gets lost when you are not in the same room together. And this kind of goes back to this idea of communication. But talk to me a little bit about how you guys, let's talk together a little bit about how you guys document your work with Paivon and Annika, and your team members, and how that's a little bit different, and why it's important when you're working remotely to make sure that that documentation is happening, even if you're not wearing shoes.
Yeah, so every meeting, in order for there to be a meeting, even if it's in block time and even if it's in Zoom, every meeting needs an agenda. That agenda needs to have at least a structure before that meeting starts. The agenda works as, turns into notes of the conversation, which one of the people who's at the meeting volunteers to keep up with. Not an ad hoc, like not a verbatim, reminiscing of everything, but just something that's dropped in together so that people can follow along and there's a historical record of what we're talking about. In terms of structure, where documents live is we have a shared Google Drive that we use that's very clearly set up and marked so that everyone sort of knows that drafts of the newsletter are found here, company documentation is found there. And everybody kind of gets that guide when they get started. Well, the new ones do. We just had our new hire start on Monday, and so she's just kind of wading into this system that we've cobbled together now. It was not this organized when I started. We were kind of shifting from whatever patchwork quilt existed that the previous executive directors had put up with to something that a staff would have to be able to use as a central repository. That's why moving to Google Suite was so important for us, not necessarily because it was Google's, but because it was a centralized system that we could structure in a way that we would find useful, since we were all going to be contributing to and learning from and reading from, right? So that's it. When we meet, there's a point to the meeting, there's a record of the meeting. We will sometimes the meetings are set up in a format that we call visioning, where one of us will put down a bunch of overall questions in order to structure a discussion. Each of us kind of answers that question, and that helps us push forward our thinking around how we're going to approach a certain topic. Recently, it's been, the realization that a strategy for an association that's premised on in-person gatherings for the next 6 months isn't a valid strategy anymore. And so what are we going to do instead? It was a clarifying moment, I want to say, about 2 weeks ago when we realized, through things that were no faults of our own, the event we had coming up in Boston next month wasn't going to happen because Massachusetts is in a state of emergency and the university that was going to host us is shut down. So out of our hands, right? What are we going to do instead? Yep. And what that turned into in that process was this was a regional meeting of our New England members, many of whom have already been in sort of early forms of communicating with each other. And so we just added a facilitation layer on top of that, where it turned into a weekly mutual aid call, a Zoom and a Google Doc that they can use through the week to collaborate on coverage so they're not overlapping, share tips and tricks to work with each other. And Lions just the facilitator of a conversation that they're already having. We don't have to provide special super extra programming, but what we do need to do is recognize the needs of our members in an area and be there with a solution. It doesn't have to be an in-person event or a happy hour. It can just as easily be using one of our Zoom licenses and allowing them to set up a set time to call,
It's funny. These webinars have spun directly off of what we would normally do. At the source, one of the things that we've really built out is our in-person strategy. And we, even one of our values is we would prefer to do journalism with people than to them. Right. And so that means lots of in-person events and lots of gatherings and lots of happy hours, and all of those things can't happen anymore. And so in a different kind of a crisis, we would be doing this all in person at the office. All these things would be happening in the office. And so we're like, well, we have to figure out a way to make this virtual. And that was sort of where where a lot of these things came up. And I want to pivot there, to talk a little bit about a couple of things, but it's a good segue. And how do you think, I'm interested in getting your thoughts on this, because you have this big, wide national lens that you're looking at this. And I wonder how you think that this massive crash course that the United States, well, frankly, the world, but we'll just kind of key in on our country, the United States is going through this massive crash course in remote working. Like all these people, I mean, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people are now at their kitchen tables right now trying to figure out what to do. And their bosses are looking at this and they're thinking, so we're all going through this crash course. Can you see that what do you think this does after coronavirus? Like, do you see more of us working remotely? What do you
sorry.
see?
Chief Morale Officer just arrived. Yeah. So I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about it in the context of how our members are organizing around this and what potential they have, because so much of their livelihood is tied to places to go and things to do and the advertising of them. There are whole businesses that have been successful in journalism, The Athletic being the most recent of them, that are entirely tied to a revenue stream that no longer exists in the short term. Not to mention like ESPN, right? Mm-hmm. Which lost $3 million in March Madness advertising in the blink of an eye when there was no more March Madness. So the two things I think about is, I think it's going to be a lot easier to argue for and hold a remote position almost everywhere. Mm-hmm. As a consequence, employers are going to be a lot less likely to foot the bill for expensive center city office space around the country. Mm-hmm. In a world where already a lot of the biggest commercial real estate clients were connected to WeWork, which was on shaky ground, it's just going to further destabilize that segment of the economy. I think there's going to be a fascinating business around what I read described in an MIT story as the shut-in economy. Delivery food, because people are still alive and buying things. They're just not going out and getting them at this place they're sourced. And so how can local news and information companies be that intersection? And I think you're going to see a lot more e-commerce. I think you're going to see a lot more virtual gatherings, maybe not just in programs like this, but in places like Second Life. And, VR and AR platforms, VR office karaoke, anyone? VR dating? Yeah. For people, right? Like, this is going to become something that's not entirely tied to, it's weird. It sounds almost like science fiction, but there's not a lot more science fiction than needing to be scanned with a temperature gun before walking into an office. It's another thing that's going to wind up happening. I can't imagine us flying and traveling, in a world that's organized by conferences and in-person events, because that's where the work gets done. We're going to have to find another way for that work to get done, because nobody's going to feel comfortable flying around at the drop of a hat in the way that we used to. Jay was prescient this year when he put a tweet up at the beginning of this year saying, imagine if all of a sudden journalism conferences stopped and we used all that money instead for journalism. Half of that came true because the conferences are stopping. Right. I'm blaming it on Jay. But the other half of it is, at the last time there was a journalism conference was a NICAR, National Institute of Computer Assisted Reporting, which is part of the Investigative Reporters and Editors Conference. At that conference, an attendee tested positive for COVID-19, which led to isolations in multiple newsrooms across the country. Universities like Temple, which had sent staffers, had people self-quarantining. It's just a very visible explanation of the risk. There's still going to be an investigative reporting. Settle down. My dog gets very excited by Amazon trucks. And that's already been, a virtual explosion, right? And how people are getting their goods and services. It's now almost entirely delivery. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know that it's a seismic change so much as that it quickly accelerates what was already happening to a large degree.
That's sort of that's kind of what I'm thinking is that, one of the things is the office space thing was something that I was thinking a lot about. And I was just sort of considering how much innovation is going to come in the space that we are in right now. Like how rapidly and that is going to develop and get better because Crowdcast, which we're using today, has a new customer, and it's called us. And and I'm sure that there are thousands upon thousands of us right now. And so I just think there's going to be this interest in there that is probably going to be something that would have taken a lot longer if we hadn't done it this way. I have a quick question here, and then we'll pivot to audience questions. What's the one or two pieces of tech that, as a remote worker, that you or your team just you couldn't live without? Those
wireless headphones. Yeah, good wireless Bluetooth headphones. And my wife just got me these. These are AirPods Pro, which is a really fancy purchase that I didn't expect to love as much as I do, because of the noise cancellation feature. Since my kids are unexpectedly home. And because they connect so seamlessly to the laptop with which I'm doing this, and I can, with a drop of a click of a button, take a phone call on my iPhone through them. They've just been a godsend. Just this little baby hopping up into my lap when I had a pair of wired headphones on when I was interviewing caused the laptop to go flying because the wires were everywhere, right? And so it's made my personal stuff a little bit easier because of reasons like that, but also because it's just insanely. It's like I forget I have them in, honestly. Once this call's over and the noise cancellation's on, unless there is an unexpected thing, I'm just plugging away and in the zone. So that's the biggest change for me, has been useful tech that I don't realize what a big change it makes to the workflow until a day or two. And I'm like, wow, that's really handy and useful, So.
Yeah. For us, I think Slack has been a big deal for remote working because, and I mean, truth be told, the Source was built, when we decided that we were going to start it, we decided that one of the first decisions we made was we were not going to own a server. And so that predicated all these other decisions about, okay, well, all of our, we're going to be on G Suite because it's baked, the cloud is baked into it. And then we looked at, all of the other decisions that we've made have been about, okay, what's my option on the cloud? Because a server-based solution is not an option. And so certainly the cloud is an important piece of tech for us. Slack is an important piece of tech for us. And it's kind of the things that come with, G Suite. For those of you that are considering it or you're on it, that you may not even know are there, is that with a professional G Suite account, video conferencing via Google Chat is baked right in. And unless you have a huge team or you have a requirement for recording conversations, that works really well. I mean, we're using it right now in the middle of this crisis, and it's operating just fine. So that's been important for us. The other thing a question that I had that I wanted to touch base on is sort of the idea, you touched on it a little bit with teams that are remote, and that is the focus on the thing that you would naturally see, which is, as a team member, you would naturally feel the vibes coming off of your team members, in a shared space. If you're in a cubicle or if you're around a conference table, somebody's energy is just going to be much easier to see. And so what I've had to kind of lean forward into is just making sure that we're checking in on people in a way that is almost awkward. It's like, how are you doing today, Chris? And really meaning how are you doing today? Because I can't tell. I don't know. And, and that's harder. But I think it for us, it's turned out to be really key. Honestly,
I'm going to answer that in a roundabout way, and that's for the last maybe 2 months, I felt myself really missing that small team in-person camaraderie, and have been second guessing the decision, or at least questioning my own logic in setting up a sort of national team that I only met with remotely. But that would be the only team I would have right now, right? And I think the reason that it's just that people are social, and that winds up. So right now we're all together trying to find the things that mimic or replace the unspoken physical cues that we would give each other in an environment where we had that as part of the toolkit. So yeah, deliberation and being very almost weirdly, overtly like solicitous of other people's feelings and time is really kind of becoming just best practice and standard practice. And what's going to wind up feeling weird is walking up to somebody and giving them a hug in 6 months when that's okay again, right? Or like just casually shaking hands and then rubbing your eyes, which is all stuff that like I'm already freaking out about when I see it on TV, right? Like I'm very looking forward to being like that guy in 10 years when a movie's on and saying, haha, he flew. That wasn't possible at that time. That movie could not have been set in March 2020 because we knew nobody was flying that, right? Like that's so it's already I'm thinking about, it's hard to not think about when it's today's opening day, right? In a normal world, we'd all be going to baseball games and sitting next to each other and spilling beer on each other in the stands. And going into crowded men's rooms of uncertain hygiene in the best of times. And, like these are all things that are, right. Well, yes, exactly. Exactly.
So, of an old friend of yours that you've known for a long time, Carl Hunnell asked a question, which I'm glad he asked. And you got to give credit. Most everyone on this chat knows Carl, or knows of his work here at the Source and before then at our friendly competitors at the Mansfield News Journal. But Carl asks here, what's the key for older folks to keep up with with the changing and evolving information technology? My first laptop was an IBM Selectrix 2 typewriter. And I have to give it to Carl. I mean, Carl is he's been so open to, he's like, well, whatever, Slack. Yeah, just send me the invitation-y thing, the thingamajig, and I'll try it out. And he walks right into it. But we've talked about this a lot on these webinars over the last week about how generationally what might seem natural to somebody who is a Gen Y or a millennial, what just seems like a natural thing to do, is going to be a lot different for a Gen Xer, an older Gen Xer, or even a boomer that is that's still actively working in the economy. And we're talking about that. I know a friend of mine, Cheryl Myers, on the chat, and she was talking about how her real estate company that she's a part of, they had done their first team meeting of like 30 different realtors all on a Zoom call, and getting everybody on that call was not as easy as it seemed. There was a lot of up cycles there. So maybe talk a little bit about does this go back to the empathy thing again of just sort of knowing?
Yeah, I think it's a culture. So in my view, it would stem from the culture of your organization, right? It would come from, it would start at the top, and it would just sort of make sure that everyone knows that we're going to make a lot of mistakes, and that's okay. That that tools are just tools, and what's important necessarily isn't using them well facilitates conversation, but using them at all sometimes is a challenge. And just making and trying for people to be patient with each other. All skills which translate really nicely, whether you're doing it virtually or visually or asynchronously, is take the time to when you're interacting with somebody, be interacting. You're not waiting for your turn to say the thing you've been waiting to say. You're absorbing what you're taking in and thoughtfully responding to it, even if it takes a second or two, even if because that's the kind of stuff, like the thing that gets, for me, the most lost in a place like Slack, if you're using it as your primary communication tool. Slack is marvelous at speed and sharing and really lousy at tone. Tone is an underappreciated element in the sort of toolkit of a manager or a coworker, because people read all kinds of things into capital letters or lowercase letters, or a poorly placed. There are times when a joke seems appropriate in Slack, but really can hit a wrong tonal note and just cause things to go kind of sideways in a hurry. So Slack also can feel like something people need to act on, which is why I've been a lot more deliberate about it. I have a team that's no longer a news team now. They're a team of builders, and builders don't always love to get interrupted in the same way a short attention span theater reporter does. Like, reporters depend on getting interrupted because the interruption changes the material they're working on, yep, or adds to it or changes course, right? And when you're in the middle of developing a, sales plan, or you're, neck deep in trying to figure out the code of something, to all of a sudden be interrupted by a ping from Slack and it's like a joke or a GIF,
right?
Or it just hits such a weird, it's a different team. So that's that's the work I'm doing, right? Which is managing an association and not a journalism outlet. But it's also just sort of like making sure you can't lose the deliberation. It just makes the deliberation of your communication style that much more important when nobody's in the same room to read those social cues, because one feeds into the other. So without that physical cue, you have to figure out how to appropriate what you're trying to say using the tools that you have.
Right. And
that is why, and a long story short, that's why we use Slack probably less than you think we might. It's not a super active thing. It's a, hey, everybody, when you get a second, and you almost have to say that every time, because otherwise you assume it's
not
there
right
to
now.
be acted upon, right? Like when you get a second, when you get a moment, hey, is anyone free to, and it's very much that, right? When something is in a public channel.
It's we're probably two of the worst people in the world to act like we know what we're doing here, because news people are not known for their ability to shut it off and do self-care. And set some limits. But I think that's sort of one of the last things I wanted to touch on today was going to the office is an always on world. We're in an always on world anyway, right? Like, you have this option to be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week anyway. But there's something about getting up and going to the office at 8 a.m. and then coming home at 6 p.m. that there is like these sort of beginnings and endings to your day. You're transitioning out of sleep and into work, and out of work and into family or home time. And then, there's a rhythm there that is there. But in this world that we're in now, or in the remote world, I sense that that's even harder, because it's all occurring. If your laptop is on, if your notifications are on, you're available. And I've had to work really hard at that, just in little subtle ways, to try to signal to people that I message that, listen, I don't have an expectation at this point. I mean, to the point, like, all of my emails have a signature line at the bottom that just says, please don't feel obligated to reply to this email during evenings or weekends unless you want to. I'm like, my dysfunction doesn't have to be your dysfunction. Just because I'm answering email at 10 o'clock at night doesn't mean that I have an expectation that you would.
Right.
Talk to, how are you guys dealing with that in a remote world? And, assuming that a lot of the folks that are on this call or watch this video are in a remote world, how do you, any one or two things that work really well for you and your team in terms of understanding what those boundaries might be, or how you might manage those?
Well, I'm probably the last person who should be giving any kind of advice on a work.
Right. I know. We really are truly two alcoholics trying to tell people drinking. I mean, it's a hard thing to do.
Yeah. Especially in the moment. Well, it is a little easier in this job when you're because Lion is not involved in journalism. We help the journalists, right? And so there's not a whole lot that's going to wind up happening in that space on a Saturday and Sunday. There's just not. Lately, as we've been sort of dragooned into larger conversations that are more timely, I have an ending deadline, and it feels like a project kind of working its way through, which has meant, staying up a little bit later or pulling out the laptop at odd hours or, signing on first thing in the morning. But the nature of it also is, I find mental health breaks during the day when I can get them. So if nothing is on my immediate radar, I don't really feel afraid to shut the computer and go wash dishes, right? Or, it's my son's birthday, I'm going to go bake a cake. And I have a little bit of time in my day. It's between one call and the next, and the other thing that keeps me sane is getting outside to deal with the dogs, walking the dogs, just that not worrying too much if one of my calls winds up being audio only, because they really need to go out, and it's also nice to have that schedule. That's been one of the harder things to get used to about a remote job where I don't have somebody breathing over my shoulder. I'm the breathing over the shoulder. I'm the manager, and we're not really organized so that I need things all the time. So making sure the team knows their expectation isn't necessarily, I need you in that chair for 8 hours at a stretch with a half-hour lunch and 2 15-minute breaks. It's not that kind of a role. It's not that kind of a job. In fact, the team tends to work longer, right? Tyvon's organized her day and has her phone near her bed because she sometimes gets up at 4 o'clock in the morning and drops 4 things into Slack as they occur to her when she sleeps. I can't work like that. I can't do that. But that's how she prefers to work. So it's trying to figure out, as an effective manager of a remote team, facilitating and not getting in the way, not mandating strictures, but sort of adjusting to how the team is working, which is why, and that feeds back into the structure of that meeting. Are we sure the stuff we've set up is working, and how would we know? It also means, I think, every 6 months or so, it's important for us to try to sort of take a step back from that and feel whether we are truly, does it feel like a team? Or does it feel like 4 separate things going on in 4 separate silos that only happen to intersect every once in a while? And if that's okay, that's great. If not, how do we make it more of a team structure and less of an individualized thing? So it winds up, it's interesting. Cheryl just dropped something in the chat about using social media more and being plugged in more. I find myself needing to shut it off when I need to get something done, especially over the last few weeks that have felt like months, because the volume of information and its severity is something I haven't seen on a personal level since 9/11. And at a professional level, honestly, as a global local story ever, I don't think there's a bigger thing that's happened to us in modern times, period. End of discussion. For those who lived in New York, or for those who deal with hurricanes or life-changing events, absolutely there have been things that have altered your life, but not everyone's life. Like, schools didn't close nationwide during 9/11. Right? Businesses didn't close, restaurants didn't shut down. You could still go out to eat. You could still get an ice cream cone in the wake of those events. And in almost the whole country, you can't anymore. It's what did I see? 1.5 billion people in lockdown right now. 1.5 billion with a B. That's seismic, right?
It's funny because, like, not to put the work that local newsrooms do on par with what first responders like healthcare workers are dealing with right now, because it's not the same thing. We're not talking about the same thing, but it does feel somewhat like the work that we're doing right now is first responder type of work. I mean, it's just the volume of information coming, the desire or necessity to try to be there to receive that information, respond to it, and get it to our reader quickly and reliably is, you really feel that. And I've sensed that on our team during, I don't think we call them health checks, but during our check-in meetings with leadership or, with our newsroom periodically, you can sort of see it wearing on people, and people are wearing it differently. And it is sort of like this, we've had some dialogues with folks about, listen, it's okay for you to miss a story, it's okay for you to just kind of take a couple hours and chill out. And I think that, as at least leaders in time, especially when we're working remotely, it all focuses back into this sort of like, really deliberate empathy toward the team that you're on, either whether you're leading the team or whether you're a member of that team, and thinking about how you can help one another during a stress time. Because if this was perfect, like if everything was normal, quote unquote, and we all went remote, there would be stresses associated with that anyway. But we're remote, and we can't even go for a drink with our friends after or we have to like, you know, hack together these sort of like, we did a walking happy hour yesterday after work, where we practiced social distancing guidelines to go cups and dogs, but you had like this parade of people that were 6.5 feet away from each other walking down the street with a bunch of solo cups, because we just, you know, it was just trying to get in some way, shape, or form to be in the same relative physical zone with each other, but at the same time, you know, in this new world. So we're kind of coming toward the end of the broadcast. So if you've got any questions, make sure you drop them into the chat, and for Chris and I, and we will be posting this video to Richland Source along with the videos from our previous webinars this week to Richland Source. I think we're going to start that on Friday or Saturday. Brittany would be able to know that. She's kind of leading that team. Again, I want to thank Chris for being here with us today. I want to thank our members and our newsroom partners for helping to power this work. We want to thank the Facebook Journalism Project for the grant that is partially underwriting this effort and the rest of our COVID-19 coverage. And I want to make sure that we let you guys know that if you want to support independent local journalism and you want to learn a little bit more about what Chris does, you can do that at lionpublishers.com, and you can understand a little bit more of the ecosystem that he and Paivon and Annika are supporting. And if you want to support independent local journalism in our region, we would welcome that, and you can do that at sourcemembers.com, and Brittany can drop a link into the chat for that. You can learn a little bit more about our membership program and how you can help support independent local journalism like this. Tomorrow, we have a great webinar that is much more generally focused. We're going to be talking about coronavirus and our kids. And we're going to talk, we've got two fantastic guests. Emily Talbot from the Providers for Healthy Living. Emily is a licensed clinical social worker who has a tremendous amount of experience counseling kids. And we're also going to be joined by Kristen Gilbert of the Mansfield Area Y. The Mansfield Area Y is the largest child care provider in the region. And so they know a ton about kids and what they're going through right now. They're also a licensed pandemic child care facility. If you're trying to deal with child care in this particular zone, the Y is a place that can help you. You can join us tomorrow at noon, and make sure, finally, before we go, make sure you click the follow button in your windows. That way you'll be notified when we go live with new topics. And again, thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you for all you're doing for independent local journalism, and for taking the time out from your busy schedule in Philly to join our listeners and our readers today.
Happy to help. Thanks for having me. Yeah,
absolutely. Have a good day. How's your health? Checking in with you. You doing good? Okay, thumbs up.
Doing good. Making sure you're good too. Hi, everybody.
Fantastic.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you tomorrow at 12. Thanks. Bye.